All right, so welcome. You're in the right place if you were wanting to join Riparian Forest Buffers and hearing about Virginia Tech's Catawba Sustainability Center. I'm going to get you started with just some introductions about buffers and why we love them so much at James River Association. And then you're going to hear from John Munsell, who's a professor and forest management extension specialist at Virginia Tech, as well as Adam Taylor, who is the manager of the Catawba Sustainability Center. So most of you know who JRA is, but just a real quick snapshot. We are a nonprofit, and our mission is to protect the James and connect people to the James. And the area that we are focused on is the watershed, which is in green on the map. And we do our work through 4 A's: awareness, appreciation, action, and advocacy. And I head up our restoration program. I'm the Senior Watershed Restoration Manager. And so that could be from riparian forest buffer projects to living shorelines to stormwater. So to get started on the topic of the evening, we're talking about riparian forest buffers. And some folks, this might be a new term. So just so that we're all on the same page, a riparian forest buffer is that area along a stream, a lake, the river, that contains a combination of trees, shrubs, or other perennial plants. And it's really one of the best ways to improve water quality. So there's an image that kind of gives you an idea. These forested areas along our banks help filter runoff that might be coming from farms or agricultural uses or urban landscapes. And that picture at the bottom is a site near Scottsville along the banks of the James. And it really clearly shows that area of vegetation that we're really talking about, those wonderful forest buffers right along the banks of our waterways. So some of the problems across the James watershed, you can see here in the photos, and something we're making great progress on, especially our partners with the soil and water conservation districts, by fencing out cattle. But there's still a lot of cattle in our streams that are a problem, as you can see in those photos. And even in our urban landscapes where folks love to mow the grass right up to the edge of those streams. So we are facing some issues across the watershed with lack of riparian forest buffers. And I'll go over a few top reasons why we love forest buffers, and I'll put a link to this. This is actually from Stroud Water Research Center in Pennsylvania. They give kind of their top reasons why riparian buffers are so awesome. One is that they lead to cleaner streams with better water quality. And we all know that we depend on water for life. It's our drinking water for many of us in the James River watershed, and it's where a ton of us like to spend time. Another reason is that this one is something a lot of people don't realize, but healthier stream ecosystems better able to process pollution. So basically, streams that have grass buffers aren't as good at even providing that in-stream quality. So there's some stats up there. Streams bordered by forest are up to 2 to 8 times more effective than those with grass borders in processing important substances like excess nitrogen. Because if you can imagine streams going through forested areas, they're also getting all of the leaf litter that's falling off the trees, and there's a whole ecosystem happening in the water there that's helping to clean water even more. It's able to support things like mussels that also are cleansing the water. So basically, clean water leads to cleaner water. And number 3 is it's better habitat for aquatic life. If there's any fishermen in the room, fisherwomen as well, brook trout are a great thing for a lot of folks. And they depend on cool streams. And that's an image that just kind of shows you that areas where they have these kind of consistent vegetated corridors, there's more trout populations, and where there's gaps, they don't see as much. And the 4th one is enhanced property values, which could be benefits to farms. Nobody wants to lose the land that they are stewarding and caring so much for. And forest buffers really help to stabilize those banks. And that's a picture down on the left. We did a buffer project at a local brewery in Scottsville, and adding those streams along the banks created a beer garden for folks to hang out in. So there's lots of different ways that buffers and trees along our creeks can enhance property values. And then the last one is improved recreation and human health benefits. There's a ton of research out there around how special these places are along water, especially when there's trees around, how important those are to our mental health, and who doesn't need a little bit of that these days. So that's something we personally love about buffers as well. Now I'm going to pass it over to Adam and John, who are going to show you some awesome stuff that they are doing down at the Catawba Sustainability Center, just outside of Roanoke in the Upper James watershed. You should be able to share your screen, either John or Adam.
Hello, Amber. Hi. Am I upside down?
Yeah, that's awesome.
Okay.
That's great.
So nothing like starting a presentation with egg on your face and it's actually falling off this way. I have a new computer, folks. I'm sorry. It was just working on Google Meets where Adam and I jumped on, assuming that's where the meeting was going to be. So a little bit of a rocky start here. And because in the interest of time, I'm not going to try and fiddle around with my settings anymore. I'm just going to go ahead and stop video. That's great because I've got a lot of cool imagery to show you, kind of cover, you know, oh, I'm sorry. Maybe if you can mute, that would help to reduce ambient noise. But I'm going to go ahead and do that now, and then I'll share my screen and get started on my presentation because trust me, the pictures are a lot better to look at than me upside down. Okay, can someone confirm that you are able to see my slides?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yes, so thank you everyone for the opportunity to be with you this evening. Adam and I am excited to kind of share a lot of the work that we've been involved with at the Catawba Sustainability Center, which is appropriately and very clearly aligned with what the James River Association is focusing on and some of the projects that Amber and others are leading. So great little intersection this evening. And we are going to talk about riparian buffers at Virginia Tech's Catawba Sustainability Center. And you can see the Sustainability Center there. It's a near 380 acre property. And Adam's going to go into much more detail about all the different projects and activities that are ongoing on the farm. But we're also going to jump a little bit outside of the riparian buffer zone as well, and thinking about some of our first line of defense plantings that we've also been looking at with respect to contour tree planting. And you can see some of that in the bottom portion of the image. And I'm with Forest Resources and Environmental Conservation at Virginia Tech, and Adam is with Outreach and International Affairs, which has the Catawba Sustainability Center in its portfolio. All right, so I don't know how many of you have heard of agroforestry before, but I will provide a brief overview for those of you that haven't, or it's a little bit hazy for some that maybe have heard the term but don't necessarily know all the ins and outs. And then talk about multifunctional riparian buffers and contour plantings, which fall, at least the way we're working with them, under the larger umbrella of agroforestry. And then I'll turn it over to Adam, who will talk about some of the history, kind of the backstory of the Catawba Sustainability Center, some of the different activities that are underway, and provide some perspective on plantings that he's managing that are both buffer based, but also upslope in the contour areas, using trees and shrubs for both production purposes, you know, food and fiber, those types of things, but also conservation, ecosystem services. And then I'll come back and provide some perspective on lessons and opportunities and tools that have kind of stemmed from some of our work together on the farm, and then we can open it up for Q&A. So agroforestry, you know, what is it? Technically defined, it's an intensive and holistic land management practice that optimizes the benefits. And optimize is critical here because we're talking about combining trees, crops, and or livestock in the same place. So, you know, resources are finite and there's always competition for those resources. And so when you start to integrate multiple species into the same place, you have to think about optimizing those systems so that you can achieve and continue to achieve a level of production regarding food and fiber while also achieving some of these important environmental services. And what does it take? Well, it's adaptive. There's no doubt. I mean, when you're starting to mimic a multi-species ecosystem, you're managing trees, shrubs, crops, livestock potentially all together in the same place. You've got to keep your eye on that, and that requires adaptation over time. And then because we're talking about trees and crops and livestock and all of those things together, I mean, we have to think about interdisciplinary teamwork. I think we all know, defined ourselves in terms of these silos regarding, oh, I'm an ag person, or I'm a forestry person, or I'm a livestock person, and we have our own departments, and so we're kind of split naturally, but we have to think about that teamwork. And then what that does is help us balance production and ecosystem services by basically leveraging that knowledge and expertise base together to manage these dynamic systems. And really, when I think about it, or we can think about it, is we've got that distinct boundary, and we often think about our farmland and our forest land in that regard, right? Forest land's over here, farmland's over here, other side. But what we're doing is we're taking what we know about managing trees and pulling that into the agricultural space. And we're also thinking about, the farming proposition and what that means in terms of how we can manage for non-timber products in our forest lands. So it's not a single tree in a field. And it's not going out to the woodlands and harvesting in the wild growing populations of much of the non-timber plants or fungi that you can get your hands on. It really is about blending these things together. It's about trees, like I've mentioned, in the crops, managing those things in the same space. And you can do that in the field, as you just saw, or you can do that under the canopy of a woodland, where you have shade obligate species that have markets, right, that have benefits, medicinal products, edible products. You can also gather those things out of the woods, basically cultivate them. So it looks like something along these lines, a silvopasture, where you have a nice forage base, you've got cattle, you've got trees being managed in the same space, and then nice stand of golden seal. Or what we see here in Cameroon, which is the intercropping of Caliandra with maize. That's a nitrogen fixing tree. And so they intercrop that with the maize, and that's an agroforestry system. You have your tree and your crop together, they're being managed simultaneously. Or windbreaks. Maybe you're familiar with windbreaks. One of the more popular, well-known agroforestry practices in the Midwest. That's also essentially the blending that I'm talking about. And so get it all out of the way, which is good to know, kind of the universe of agroforestry options. We also think about multifunctional riparian buffers. That does fall under the umbrella. And by that, what we mean is that there are multiple things happening, multiple benefits associated with those buffers. So the agroforester doesn't just think about the buffer as an area where you want to plant perennial crops, but where you plant perennial crops and the species that are selected also provide agricultural opportunities. So here we see hydrangea planted along the Catawba Creek at the Catawba Sustainability Center. And so that's a marketable floral crop on a perennial species that's providing all the ecosystem services that we want in our wooded riparian buffers. But at the same time, on top of that, you have a production opportunity. And I'd just like to note too that it's not just rural areas where agroforestry is playing out, and buffers also too in the multifunctional sense, but also increasingly in towns and cities. And that's one thing that's nice about agroforestry. It can be scaled, right? It can be in the backyard, or it can be on a 1,000-acre farm. It can also be in a park. And there are examples across the country where people have planted fruit and nut trees in a community food forest, and they've also integrated those plantings into riparian areas to try and protect and maintain, some water quality through a water body moving in that urban area. So at the end of the day, it's really about diversification and whole farm planning. It's about whole property management. It's about what you can do across a landscape, not what you can't do. And we have this fancy term, polyculture. All that means is it's not a monoculture, which would be one crop, but it's combining, integrating. And you can see that across the landscape here at Catawba. And I love to throw this quote out from a student of mine in 2012. It's in the agroforestry class, which I teach at Virginia Tech. Said, if you can't do one thing, you can always do something else. And that, I kind of alluded to that in the earlier slide. It's about positive feedbacks. It's about asking yourself what you can do across a landscape as opposed to, restricting in certain ways. All right, so let's land at the multifunctional riparian buffer in the agroforestry sense. And of course, very important to the organization and folks that have joined the webinar is, how to take a landscape that looks something like this, exposed creek bank, not a lot of shading, not a lot of detritus. So you have some habitat issues, you've got stabilization issues. Obviously too, you have runoff issues happening. How do you take this particular area of land and kind of move through a sequence of time? And now we might fast forward, say, 5 or 6 years here. That's actually more like 3-4 years following planting along that same creek bank to getting to something like this, which is also the same creek bank 8 years hence. So this is what we see at the Catawba Creek, again, at the Sustainability Center. And I don't know if Amber mentioned, but there is a workshop upcoming, maybe you know about that, where you can tour on site and learn about in person some of the activities that we've been involved in. Well, how do you do that? Well, why would we do that? I guess maybe that's the most important question to ask first. And really, it's because we know that farms and pasture land contribute an awful amount in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus into surface waters. 65% annually is the estimate. But we also know that buffers, and across a series of studies, we can see a range of 60 to 95% in terms of the effectiveness in retaining nitrogen, at least in this example. Phosphorus is a little bit different in terms of its legacy issues. However, putting trees along the creek bank can be a good thing. But there is a catch because these are dynamic systems. They're not static. It's not like a set it and forget it kind of thing. Just plant the trees and all is good. And not just the trees or the buffer area, but the entire kind of aquatic and terrestrial ecosystem at that interface is very dynamic. And that has, a lot of dynamic activity in terms of the biophysical attributes and behaviors, but also the human. And that's really kind of the, point I want to drive home in terms of what we're doing at Catawba. We're both looking at the relationships of, the tree plantings, both along the creek side and upslope, and water quality and other issues related to that interrelationship and what it means from the beneficial aspects of ecosystem services, primarily with respect to water quality and water quantity. But we're also keeping an eye on the human systems because those are also dynamic. And so when you think about managing an area, we have to think about both of those being at play at the same time. And, kind of the status quo has been to work in terms of right along the creek side for some stabilization and shading and those types of things. And there's nothing wrong with a buffer system that's pretty uniform, that runs along the side of a creek, a waterway at a fixed distance. You can see up in the upper right corner there, an illustration of a uniform riparian buffer. And that's really been kind of the status quo or defining the approach for many years. And some of our standards are based around that, a certain fixed distance from, the creek side. But what we need to know is that in terms of that dynamism or what's happening in those areas, that it's not uniform necessarily. And that has some implications that we'll cover in a little bit regarding how we're approaching and have approached some of the work at Catawba and beyond. One of those two would be to consider just generally that, there is width matters. I mean, if you have particular objectives, the buffer width in terms of what we see with respect to the research shows that, certain widths are better at addressing particular issues versus maybe some of those that are more compressed. So if we think about that kind of uniform 30-foot or 35-foot buffer, you might not be getting into as much of nutrient control and sediment control benefits or flood control that you would like to. And the agroforestry model is actually one that extends out farther than the typical kind of cost share or baseline, we might say, baseline conservation width. And so we think about different zones. I mean, right along the creek bank, we have to have the unmanaged forest because that's, really a critical area for protecting water quality. But to continue and expand out and increase the benefits, we can move into these different zones, and these different zones have opportunities because we're moving laterally away from the water body to build in production, right? To create that agroforestry balance between production and conservation. In contour farming, upslope, first line of defense too, can also help in terms of controlling water flow and also filtration. So if we look at Catawba here, we can see the Catawba Creek annotated kind of running through the farm. That's the old 311 route you see. The new one is down at the bottom. You might start to pick out some of the different rows of trees that we've planted. But one thing important to note is that before any of those things were established, and this goes back to kind of the idea that uniformity is not necessarily how we need to think about these particular these projects, is that we had two pathways of flow for water out of that field upslope on that hill, and they were not uniform. They were basically channeled, and so that's a legacy effect in terms of the landscape topography. And so if we look closer, we can see that what we've done is we have established a buffer in kind of a conventional uniform sense along the creek, but we also have upslope planting with contour, on contour, using some strategies developed out of the permaculture field. And what that does is essentially, and actually that first image I showed you just kind of brought that in, of the mulberry intercrop with chestnut. I mean, that's what you're looking at over on the left side of that contour area. So I guess at the end, we have, two systems kind of working together, and buffers is our focus today, but it's important to note that upslope, there are also other activities. However, why do I throw up the question mark? Because if you're a farmer and you just look at the shaded areas, you're asking yourself, that's a lot of trees being put into the areas where I could farm. So, what's the rub here? How does this work? And that's where the agroforestry model, again, comes into play. Species selection is critical. We can select for native fruit-producing trees, which provide a product. Native nut-producing trees. So we've got our mass trees that can be selected, but also our floral species, and even potentially some livestock, upslope, and utilizing the beneficial aspects of shade from those trees to enhance production in that system. But, those are the conventional products. And I now toss up phosphorus and nitrogen because we do have ecosystem services markets that are coming online where, there are some opportunities because of tree planting, because of shrub planting, to take advantage of some of the trading possibilities around phosphorus and nitrogen, and even carbon sequestration. So throw those out there just to let you know that the complexities of the kind of agroforestry model are actually leveraged to become benefits in terms of how those systems are designed. And those systems lead to these multiple benefits. So they enhance natural capital and they mimic diverse ecosystems, right? So forests are our best and highest use when it comes to protecting water quality in a natural sense. And, so why not try to create agricultural systems that mimic those diverse ecosystems a little bit more closely? You got the conservation, health, air, water quality benefits. A lot of stuff has been demonstrated regarding integrating trees at low densities into the farming space. And we have networking across fences, social capital, thinking about managing the water quality, which cuts across, boundaries without problem, ecosystem services, no political boundaries. And then increasing human capital by reducing barriers, land class production, but aesthetics and energy efficiency are also important. And then lastly, buffering operations through diversification and differentiation is important because you have multiple streams of production happening. So you can lean on one when one is slim during 1 year and vice versa. And the latest estimates are the U.S. there's 2% of farms that practice some form of agroforestry. So not a lot. And we're working on that, I think. And I do believe there are an increasing base of producers that are interested in how these systems will work. However, I'll get into later a little bit of some of the challenges regarding establishment. But at this point, I'm going to go ahead and stop my share and turn it over to Adam so he can dive into some details regarding what you see here in the schematic in terms of the practices and the projects and such at Catawba. So thanks. I'll be back.
Well, thanks, John. So, yeah, my name's Adam Taylor. I manage the Catawba Sustainability Center as part of Outreach International Affairs. The farm is an interesting little piece of something that Virginia Tech has. We're probably the only interdisciplinary farm in the whole university portfolio. We're working with professors like John and College of Natural Resources and Environment. We work with in our College of Agricultural Life Sciences. We're working with, our College of Science. We're even doing some stuff in the College of Liberal Arts on historical research. And yeah, so it's a beautiful place where we all come together and collect and learn together. I will give you a disclaimer. I am in Catawba currently, and it's a rural area and we don't have the best internets. And so if I cut out or freeze, I hope someone will let me know. And there is a farmer's market going on under my feet right now. So if there's any weird noises, that's what that is. So yeah, we've seen this picture. It's our favorite picture of the farm. But who we are, we're a 377 acre living and learning environment for research and demonstration. So everything we do is on a sustainable model. We say, doing things now that provide for the future. One of the better definitions that I've come to know recently is that, we're putting twice as much back as we're taking from the land. And we do that in a lot of different ways. But, we try to involve community and university and state and local and everybody. We're just not limited to the university. So our three-word catchphrase is innovate, collaborate, sustain. We are trying out new things. I think a lot of the times we say they're new, but they're often older practices that people did prior agricultural industrialization. So we're bringing them back or innovating into new ways, using new technologies as well to kind of assess our impact on the land. As I said, we're collaborating with lots of different folks. We do have a rich partnership with Roanoke County, the county in which the farm is located, and they help us out in a lot of infrastructure development. We work on some rural entrepreneurship things. And then, yeah, we collaborate with this group, with the Virginia Department of Forestry, local nonprofits. It goes on and on and on. And then, yeah, sustain, right? With the Sustainability Center. So we have to have sustain. We already mentioned what that's about. This is kind of like a 5-year kind of layout of the farm map. And I can go through some of this real quick. I guess the main thing to take away from this picture is that we're highly diversified, and in a mountain farm situation like we are here on the edge of Southwest Virginia, diversified farm, multi-layered, is about the only way you can kind of make an income farming. Our farms aren't big, like maybe in the Shenandoah Valley or out in the east or out on the shore. We're confined by contour, mountains, hollers, you name it. And so if we're not multi-layered and diversified, I think it's hard for a small scale farmer to make it. Now, the Catawba's farm is bigger than most farms in the area are, being as large as it is, but we try to mimic what a small farm would be. And so up at the top here, one of our things is we do grass finished beef here. It's part of a project. We run steers. We have about a herd of 20 head, and we use them in kind of innovative ways because the cows are something that farmers in the area can kind of latch onto. It's like they know cows, people keep cows. When they see cows doing weird things, they seem to pay attention more. So we have a highly intensive rotational system, stream exclusion. Our cows have never even been in the creek. And then we're using different types of grasses and grazing different times of years, just trying to, maximize our nutrient input on the land, and building organic matter and building our soils, using the cows more as like a tool. And the byproduct of it is that we're supporting local farmers by buying calves from farmers who practice stream exclusion and planting buffers. And we give them a higher value for their weaned steers, and then bring them to the farm. And we grass finish them out, and then they go into low income neighborhoods or to the Catawba Hospital, which is across the road. You can see some of our other agroforestry things, silver pasture research, that's been planted. John mentioned that with the cows grazing under the trees. Ours is budding. We put cows in it the first time last year, just in some strips. And then we had some calves out here, let them, we call it creep graze. They could get below the fence and then kind of eat because they weren't too big to damage some of the trees. Over here is the area John was mentioning in his slides. Across 311 there, we also have another buffer, but we've done some wetland restoration as part of our water quality efforts. Our water quality for us is important, and for this group, because we're in the headwaters of the James River. So we're like right at the beginning before it comes, down the pike to you guys. And so we were able to trap in our wetland restoration project. We were able to trap road runoff and run it through a system of vernal pools using a lot of different tree species like swamp oaks and willows and lindens and sycamores to try to uptake any nutrients that might have been a runoff, let them sit in this ephemeral wetland area before draining into the creek. And it's a labor of love, but it's still happening. We do a lot of crop research. I mean, we're growing for entomology studies, biological studies on leaf matter. We're also doing community outreach programs like a small farm incubator program where we give people access to land who want to start or expand an agricultural business, mostly around organic vegetable farming. We do a lot of non-timber forest products up in the woods. You can see we have mushroom production going on, and then we're doing a lot around golden seal and ginseng and black cohosh and ramps. We're also part of the national effort to back cross the American chestnut tree. We have a chestnut orchard where we're planting nuts that fall from trees and hoping to achieve the 1516 cross for the, to bring back the American chestnut. And then we're also doing some recreation. As you can see, we have a blue blaze trail that goes through the farm, and that connects to the Appalachian Trail. So if you've, if you're familiar with the Appalachian Trail, we're kind of in the cradle of McAfee's Knob and Dragon's Tooth and Tinker Cliffs, which is called the Triple Crown for this area. And McAfee's on the whole trail from Maine to Georgia is one of the most photographed spots. And so we try to incorporate some of that into what we're doing and then bring all that into education for people visiting the farm and see what we're doing and know that our model is not your typical farm that you're going to see in the valley. So that's probably way too much that y'all needed. So we'll get into buffers. So yeah, as John mentioned, I think our buffer model out here is all multifunctional zones, multifunctional improved riparian buffers. Most of the tree species are good for something, either edible or medicinal or fiber. And yeah, I'll just get right into them. So one of the first ones we'll look at is a variable width buffer. This one's interesting because if you've ever been involved with the NRCS cost share program for stream exclusion, if you have livestock, the standard buffer width is 35 feet. And the contour of the land doesn't really lay like that. Given how your farm lays, there's going to be wetter spots here, drier spots near the creek. And what I think you're going for is stream stabilization and maximum absorption of nutrient runoff before it reaches the creek. And that might mean you fertilize or your cows are right there, but anything that's flowing downhill, having that buffer to kind of protect to something and go through it before it hits the creek is good. And so John will talk a little bit about a program a little bit later on, but looking at the contour of the farm and then how the wet area is set during rain events, this area in particular was a much wetter area, and it could also be established as a wetland. Just a little bit above it up in this area, there are wetland grasses growing right now. We've been protecting them and like they've been hayed or grazed in the past, but we're kind of mowing around them and letting them grow up until eventually we can maybe try to restore another wetland there. But some of these species aren't multifunctional. They're just really good wet species because they're in a wet area like bald cypress and sycamore. But then we have the black walnut, of course, which is rising in popularity among people wanting to eat black walnuts, and they're making lots of value-added products with black walnuts. They're also kind of medicinal in their own way. And river birch, also slippery elm type things. The bark is medicinal quality that you can pull from that. So if we come down the buffer, we come into more of a fixed width kind of look at things. And these are all in rows. And this is elderberries, which we know are good for a lot. And I'll show you some of the stuff that we've done experimenting with them. And then persimmons and mulberry. Elderberry, great medicinal, even tastes great as a syrup. And the flowers, you can do stuff with the flowers and the berry itself. Persimmons are wonderful if you like persimmons. And then yeah, mulberry, a wonderful early kind of berry fruit. So this is that buffer during the winter. You can see kind of the variable width section here. And then as we move into the fixed width rows right here. So we did a lot of experiments when we established this buffer on tree establishment. And so in this area, what we did when we planted it was we just kind of stuffed our boot in the size of the tree shelter and planted the tree with a dibble bar, put the shelter on, let it roll. As you move into this side, this was a broadcast glyphosate or Roundup spray that we eliminated all herbaceous competition and then planted into that. As we move out through here, we did a couple other techniques where we did like an actual plow and till like you would in a garden bed, but on contour with the creek, and then planting in that loose soil to see if it would aid in early root developments. And then the Department of Forestry let us borrow a scalper, which is I have a picture of it out here somewhere, which is where we can kind of run this machine through and it flips both sides of the soil over on either side and creates a ditch. And so that's taking the weed seed bank and putting it over on either side and giving you clean soil to plant into. And given that, I mean, we didn't have any weeds in there for the first season until others, seeds kind of blew in and took over. This is what that buffer looks like today. I took this picture this morning as I was going to cultivate a field. And you can see the trees are, it's messy, right? I mean, it's like, you don't think about early establishment, you want to, like nice orchard looking thing. It's messy, but if you look in here, these little grasses that are coming up here it's a big blue stem, a warm native season grass. And this is the area that wasn't sprayed that we're looking at nearest to us. And so that big blue stem is interesting because the trees kind of burst in the spring when it's wet and they send their roots further down, they're collecting lots of water. And then they need all the energy they can get to push their leaves out. And their leaves get out and they kind of just hang out for the summer. And at that time, the warm season grasses don't come online till around this time of year. This time of year, they're only, I don't know, they're getting to be about 12 inches tall out here. And so they're kind of keeping the ground covered and holding the nutrients in, and their roots go really deep, and they're benefiting while the trees are kind of resting. So it's a good symbiotic relationship that I believe they have with each other. A lot of people will want to, like, you need to go through and mow. And, we did do, and you'll see some examples where we do finish mow around. And that's mostly because we're a university and we have visitors and we can't, people come visit, you don't want to get ticks, but we do leave these areas alone just to demonstrate that. So across the bridge, we have another similar model where we have two different variable widths. So you can see that we didn't think we needed as much absorption here as we did here and across and down, again with a fixed width and some of the more similar species. And that's what that buffer looks like from the aerial. So here's some of the land prep techniques that we were talking about. The top right photo is what the scalp does. You can see it on the back of the tractor in the bottom right, but that's kind of what it looks like just after it's run through. Creates these berms, which the seed bank is in, and then the trees go directly in the middle. This was an interesting one we did, which we've, it's been good in some ways. It's come back to bite us in others. We planted all those elderberries in these weed mats, and it was good because elderberries really, struggle with the weeds in their early establishment because they're, kind of small for the first few years. But then we created habitats for voles. And so the voles came underneath and started girdling to get moisture and bark out of a lot of the elderberries and killed some of them. We lost almost like an entire row. I mean, they're doing well now that the ones that did survive get up, but we kind of created a weird habitat trying to save the elderberries. And then like maintenance of these systems, I'm always back and forth, and this is maybe not scientific, but more of like an observation. When we finish mow, like down to the, maybe 3 inches of grass that we leave, we're leaving a lot of room for bacterial infection and the diseases to come in. And also we're not feeding our trees a lot through the organic matter. So I think in the first 3 years of a tree establishment, it does need that intense kind of maintenance on it and making sure that the tree is the only thing. But after 3 years, it's developed pretty good roots. You want to start feeding it. So what I do is like, I only really mow once a month, and I do it with like a bush hog. So it's like we're growing lots of grass that we then just chop up and leave on the ground that breaks down and then just goes into the soil to feed the trees. So, you know, another model that you could do, you know, I have another small farm that me and my wife operate, and we do a lot of buffers and orchards and things like that. We run chicken tractors through them. And, you know, we're carrying water, chickens aren't getting in the stream or anything, but they are, you know, they're amazing at keeping the grass maintained and as well as putting down a fixed amount of nitrogen. And I've had like rabbit problems where they have also girdled trees, and there's been like one little sliver of bark coming up the tree from the rabbit doing it. But because they had access to so much nutrients through those chicken tractors, that they were able to hold on and survive and make it to the next year. So I mean, when you have good nutrition for the trees, I think that's very important for, you know, them being established. This is another buffer. It's kind of a little tighter. This is a tree tube study that we've done with Tubex for the tree shelters, where we're monitoring how trees do in a closed tube as opposed to a vented tube, as opposed to no tube at all. Just from early observations, if we're worried about shelters, which I think are important, the no tube at all is like, man, you're going to get a lot of deer pressure. I mean, it depends on where you're at, but you know, it's easy to lose the tree in the weeds. It's the deer are just going to gobble it up. And then I've noticed between the solid tube and the vented tube is like the solid tube gives you like a spindly tree until it can get out of that tube and get the sunlight that it needs out of the top. It's like it's blocked off from like the wind and the weather. So it doesn't really develop like a hardiness that I think that it might need. And this is good, again, purely observational. And then with the vented tube, it does get the wind and the weather and the cold a little bit more. And it seems to be a hardier stake that it gets from that. Tubes are amazing. They do a lot of different things. We experiment with two different types, a plantra and a tubex. Each one is different and has its own benefits. I do know if you're going to maintain tubes like areas a lot by mowing or something like we do out here, the wooden stakes after about 3 to 4 years tend to dry rot in the ground. And if you bump that with a mower or your bush hog, it will break off, and then you know you're replacing where the plantra has a fiberglass tube stake, which I find a little bit better, but I like Tubex's tube better and its system better. I just wish it had that fiberglass stake. This is a different model of a riparian food forest. Now these are all edible or medicinal. It's in a weird spot in the farm right next to the creek, right between the creek and the old 311. It's almost an acre. And this one we keep very maintained as like a community gathering area. We finish mow it and stuff, but it has a lot of different variety, black walnut and willow, buttonbush, Swiss hazel, persimmons, elderberry, serviceberry, hazelnuts. I mean, it's a lot of things in there, but we maintain it for the tree. So there's like paths and stuff that you can, you know, finish mow that you can walk through. It's a nice place to have a picnic or something if you're walking down. I'll just go ahead and show you a picture of it. There's a lot of different stories of trees, you know, big persimmons, big black walnuts, you know, and then you get some smaller elderberries or some witch hazels there in the back, the pawpaws. It's just, you know, a really nice model and a really great place for all these fruits and things to drop and collect and do it kind of in a community kind of gathering area. Yeah, we finish mow this just because it looks nice and we like to maintain the area for people, but it doesn't have to be, you know, it could be bush hogged, but given the sporadic planting of not in rows, it makes it a little harder to bush hog than it would like a row planted buffer. And then we call them the woody florals. John hit on the hydrangeas. You saw some pictures of them, and they're off on the other side of the creek from the riparian forest buffer. And then it's just a lot of woody floral species: red twig dogwood, viburnum, pussy willow, sweet shrub, callianthus, hydrangea, red twig dogwood, yellow twig dogwood. And these are beautiful species just to have on your farm. I know what we do with them because most of them are coppicing species. So you can cut and plug. You cut them off in the spring, and then if you want to replant them somewhere, you just stick them in the ground. And they've been really great when we have flooding area times and maybe some of our stream gets washed out, what we'll go do is go cut a bunch of red twig dogwood and pussy willow, and we'll just stick them in the stream and then just try to give, whatever eroded out, we'll go ahead and put it there to go ahead and let's get some more growth going. And they're beautiful, and they come for get a high dollar at floral markets. I know we can't really sell anything at Catawba, but again, where we are involved in the community, I have a few friends that are forest farmers that live around, florists, like cut flower kind of farms. And I'll call them when they're at peak, and they'll come down and cut a bunch and put in their arrangements. And, they really love it. And they're always like, are they ready yet? Now that I've got them on. So yeah, so they're beautiful. Here's some pictures of them. And the one on the left is hydrangea. You can kind of see across of the rows looking at it. And then my favorite of them all is the Callianthus. This little scarlet flower on here will hold a bloom well into like July, from May until July. It's just a sturdy, steady, woody floral that you can keep cutting for a long time and keep using. As far as like the early establishment from the coppicing, your red twig dogwood and your pussy willow is probably going to be the best. That's why I call them like the emergency trees. So if anything happens, we go cut those and stick in the creek to try to slow some erosion down. But that's the intentional planted multifunctional buffers that we have at Catawba. And I'll stop there.